Right. So we're at Pixel, a space industry startup building small satellite constellations for Earth observation. With us today is Awais Ahmed, CEO and co-founder of Pixel. Hello, Awais. Nice to finally meet you in person. You're a satellite building startup, right? Could you tell us what you do exactly? I mean, what satellites do you build? Who is it for? And a little bit about yourself before we get into the details.
Sure. So what we call Pixel is we are a space data company, and there's two critical aspects to that: space and data. We build hardware, which is the satellites that will go to space and take images of the Earth. And on the data side of things, we build the infrastructure and the software tools that help take that data and convert that into something that's actionable here on ground, whether it be for agriculture, oil and gas, mining, security, something else. It started with analyzing existing sources of satellite data that are currently in space. When you look at those data sets, you can do a lot of things. You can make maps, and you can use those for digital elevation mapping and whatnot. But when you want more detail, we realize that even existing satellites are woefully inadequate in what they can see. If I were to take an example of an agricultural plot, what you can tell with today's satellites is only the health status of the crops. But if you want to know what species of crop is growing there, what are the nutrient contents in the soil there, whether it's under irrigated or over irrigated, what's the chlorophyll content, you can't do that. And that is a detail that's needed from space if you want to see how things are actually changing, which are not only visible to our eyes but much beyond that. And we realized that there was an opportunity to build and deploy a constellation of hyperspectral imaging satellites that would provide 50 times more detail compared to what is up there today. And that is what sort of differentiates us. We realized that there existed no current source of obtaining hyperspectral data from space, so we had to be the ones to do that. So we said we will build and deploy our own constellation of these satellites that will provide global coverage on a daily basis, every 24 hours or so. And in that journey, we obviously had to prove that a small satellite, which is inexpensive in nature and of this quality, could be built in the first place. And that's what we have begun on. The plan is to have about 36 satellites, out of which 2 are launching this year, and then we'll follow that up with more. So that's what essentially Pixel does.
What exactly is hyperspectral imaging and why specifically hyperspectral imaging?
So there's three types of imagery you can talk about when you look at optical imagery. You have RGB, you have multispectral, and you have hyperspectral. Everything that we take from a normal phone camera or a DSLR is an RGB image. Everything that we see from our eyes is also RGB. You can't see beyond just red, green, and blue wavelengths. So that's information in three channels: red, green, and blue. You can go one step beyond this, which is a multispectral image. When you have night vision goggles that the army uses, for example, you're able to see normally during the day, but in the night you're also able to see the heat signatures of people, of plants, or something else that's living. And that's because you can see in the infrared range. So multispectral imagery is in a few red, green, blue wavelengths, but also a few infrared range. So you're going from just RG and B 3 channels to about 10 or 20 channels in multispectral. And that's what is available in space today. Whereas what you need is hundreds of bands. You need continuous information in very minute bands across the entire visible and infrared range. That's where hyperspectral comes in. So instead of just having 3 or 10 information channels, which is wavelengths, you're having hundreds of these channels in hyperspectral. And those minute channels is what enables us to identify chemical signatures, identify things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see.
How did you get into satellite building? I mean, what prompted you to get into this business?
It started with, I think, a couple of experiences while I was studying at BITS Pilani. But before that, I was always fascinated with space. While at BITS, the first thing I did was join the student team that was building a nano satellite with ISRO. And that's where I learned what it actually takes to build hardware that would work in the harsh confines of space. My passion for space had some outlet, so learning that was a really good experience. After that, I was one of the founding team members and engineering leads at Hyperloop India. So when Elon Musk and SpaceX came up with this competition, they said we have a 1 mile long vacuum tube at our headquarters in SpaceX in Los Angeles, and it's an open challenge to teams around the world to build a Hyperloop pod that could travel at really fast speeds. We were the only Indian team to be the finalists there, to be able to build a working Hyperloop pod, take it to LA. We presented to Elon and the rest of the team. And that was the steepest learning curve I'd had until then. But while we were there, that took us on a tour of the SpaceX factory, looking at the rocket engines being built, looking at the Falcon 9 booster that had landed back on Earth. That's when it crystallized that space was the space for me to be in, that I'd rather not work on anything else. Came back and started exploring as much as I could in terms of what could be done. And one of those was exploring existing satellite data, which led me to the fact that it's not enough, it's not rich enough in detail, which led to the starting of Pixel.
Building a satellite itself, is very complex, right? So it's not just your main sensor that you want to employ. Here in this case, it's your hyperspectral imaging sensor. So you have the solar panels and station keeping, thermal management, electrical management, and ground data centers and everything. So how do you build expertise in all of this when you're a startup, when you're a student? How do you build everything together?
Yeah, so I think you need to take a philosophical call in the beginning as to what parts you want to focus on, what parts you want to develop internally as your own IP versus what parts you're fine with working with different partners. There's no point in reinventing the wheel in each and every aspect of it. For example, in the ground station part of it, we don't build our own ground stations. There's already companies internationally that have a multitude of ground stations spread across the world. It doesn't make sense for us to re-spend on that infrastructure. We just use them on a pay-as-you-go basis. But on the satellite itself, that was a call that we took specifically in that we wanted to have complete control over how the camera was built, but also how exactly the satellite would be optimized towards that camera, which means getting people with relevant expertise who have done this before in the space domain or a relevant domain. One of the first things that we did when we started out was have folks who had retired from ISRO come back and help us out in terms of what would work, but more importantly, what would not work given the experience that they have seen. We then went out and gradually got people with expertise in working on space technology previously. So just fill each of those segments with really passionate individuals who have some amount of experience doing what they want to do. But being based here in Bangalore, we were able to bank on the experience and expertise that ISRO essentially brought in. And apart from that, a few things we have partners internationally that we bank on, like ground stations, for example, solar panels, for example, or things like that. So it's a combination of those.
So, how big is Pixel today, and what are you looking for in terms of people in the future? Right? What do you still lack, and what do you want to build on your own?
We have a total of 36 full-time folks today. We were, I believe, 6 before the pandemic began, and now we are close to 36. So we've grown quite rapidly there. Going ahead, what we would expect is sort of doubling this team, having one more team that can work in parallel on a different satellite mission as this team focuses on one, but also a team that can help us scale this. Right now, we have the expertise to build one or two satellites at a time. What we need is to have a facility and a capability to manufacture 10 of these every quarter. To be able to build a facility, to be able to put a supply chain and an assembly chain together to make that happen would be the next steps.
Coming to the main sensor, so do you build your own hyperspectral imaging sensor, or do you get it from somebody?
There are different components that we procure from different parts of the world which are very specialized. We don't ourselves go ahead and manufacture a sensor per se because we don't have a foundry. But what we do is we design the camera. We know what it takes to put the optics together with the focal plane array, with the electronics that all go together. And once you put those three aspects together is when you get that hyperspectral imager. So that's something that we have control over. We obviously work with relevant, experienced partners in this regard. For example, when we design our optics, we then go to a specialized optics manufacturer to get it manufactured for us. We go to a specialized sensor and filter depositor to be able to get that hyperspectral sensor. We go to someone else who's really experienced in putting that back end electronics together. But in the end, it all comes together in sort of a package at Pixel, and that's something that, as I said before as well, we wanted to have control over how the specs of the camera looked like.
The reason I'm asking you is because ISRO themselves have a HISIS satellite in place right now, and they built their own satellite, and I think SCL made it. So, which is where this comes from, right? So you can use or maybe learn from their experience and build your own. So
Yeah.
Where does yours get built?
Our manufacturing happens is spread across India and South Africa. As of now, we have certain manufacturing done here and certain parts done in South Africa. But the difference between what HISIS has been able to do versus what we are doing is that the HISIS one is a spectrometer. It has these gratings and mirrors, and it's a large camera essentially. You can't have a micro satellite that is going to house that detector and that camera. Whereas with us, it's a very miniaturized camera. It's not more than 3.5 kilograms right now, right? And the satellite is not more than 40 kilograms, which is a far cry from 380 kilograms that the ISRO satellite is. So we saw whether we could build on top of that. but it didn't make sense because it was going to be exorbitantly expensive for us. We had to figure out our own way of putting it together.
Right, so that was the sensors. How about the rest of the satellite? Right, the solar panels, the frame itself, and your antennas and reaction wheels or propulsion, whatever you do for station keeping. So, where do you source all of that from?
Yeah, we don't build all of these ourselves, as I said. We don't have to reinvent all the wheel, but we are the only ones that know how it all goes together in our satellite. The avionics piece and the software piece is something that's completely done internally. But solar panels, for example, they come from Europe. Reaction wheels and other sensors and torques also come from Europe and from Canada and places like those. So that way we have a global supply chain in place. One of the things we learned from the pandemic last year is not to be dependent on just one vendor or a subcontractor in one country, because if something stops there, then your entire work stops. So right now we do have multiple countries, multiple operators to whom we can go and say, hey, this is what we need, and then all of it comes here to our facility to put it together.
How has the pandemic affected you? You were supposed to launch your satellite a while back, and then that got pushed. And
Yeah, I think the pandemic in quantitative terms has set back us by at least a year. We wanted to have launched our satellite earlier this year, but that didn't happen because we had to lose a lot of months in between not testing the satellite, because we couldn't go to the facility and be able to test it and travel around or get access to these facilities during the pandemic. All that got pushed. We were in a race against time in the early parts of this year, trying to make that February launch. And we were almost there. We had done all the testing that was required to be able to send this up there. We had done our thermovac testing. We had done the hardware in the loop simulation testing at these facilities. But we ran into software issues on the day that we were supposed to ship the satellite to Sriharikota. And we decided not to take a risk and not launch then. Since then, the satellite has now undergone a couple more levels of testing on the software, and everything is working as it's supposed to be. We just have to wait for the next possible launch opportunity that goes into an orbit we want from ISRO, which should be around October of this year. So I would say the effect of the pandemic has been that launch got delayed, which has delayed a whole bunch of different things.
from now until the satellite gets launched, so what do you have to do in terms of getting your satellite ready and handing it over to ISRO, and what do they expect from you? How does that work?
A major chunk of that has already been completed, I would say. All we need to do right now is have it undergo a final series of tests, which it has already undergone, but just as a final level of thing. So I would say the first satellite is ready to be able to launch in October. What we're working on right now is a second satellite to go up in December. That's predominantly where the efforts are, but also the efforts are on the constellation, upgraded constellation satellites to go up next year. The first satellite, a lot of work has already been completed. Final series of tests, and it's good to launch.
You're talking about a constellation, right? So, can you tell us how many will go up, when, and what exactly you're looking for when you talk about a constellation? Why do you need a constellation? How does that work? And how do how does it whole thing work?
Yeah, we're looking at it in 3 phases. Phase 1 is demo satellites, 2 demo satellites this year. Phase 2 is the minimum viable constellation, which is the 8 satellites that we want to launch next year in 2022. And finally, it's the total number of satellites that will get us to a point we need, which is 36 satellites in total by 2023. So 2 satellites in 2021, 8 more in 2022, and then 36 in total in 2023. The reason for that constellation is we want to provide global coverage to our customers on a 24-hour revisit. So no matter where we need to see things, changing on a 24-hour basis. And the constellation is also designed in such a way that the image consistency is maintained. Every time we take an image over Bangalore, for example, the lighting conditions, the time of imaging, and everything else will be relatively the same, which means that when you want to go back and do some analysis on that data, you have that uniformity of data, and that is across the globe. That's how we are looking at it.
Building and launching satellites is just the first step, or maybe just one big part. So how do you plan to work with all of the information that you collect, right? Do you plan to put in a data center, or maybe here in Hyderabad or somewhere, and then you'll have to have teams that analyze the data that come in and then put it in a way where you can actually sell the data? So do you have plans for machine learning and data analysis, pretty much big data type thing for later?
I would say there's a little bit of a minute difference there, in that we are not going to be doing the analysis ourselves. but we are going to be building the tools and the platform that enables anyone to do the analysis. For example, the tool could be removal of cloud mask from an image. The tool could be a machine learning model that identifies cropland and water area, or it could be something as simple as an atmospheric correction module, right? So those are the tools that we want to provide on the platform itself, where it's as easy as drag and drop into the work area or the play area in the platform, and they can create a workflow of their own. So we already have a team that's working on this. We have a team that's working on the processing pipeline. It's not enough to just get raw data down. You need to process it to a point where it's analytics ready. And then you also need to have these tools and the platform where customers can go in and then search the imagery and then use these tools, making it as easy for them as just working on, like, anyone that knows how to work on a browser or a computer should be able to go to the platform and say, hey, this is what I need. This is just, I need to put it together in the form of this workflow, and then it comes out. So we're already working on that, but yes, there's plans to expand on those. But from a data center perspective, there's no plans of doing a physical data center as yet. We are working on Azure and AWS because it's just much more convenient at this point. There might be a point where we might look at transitioning into our own.
Once you have the data and you collect it and process it, you need to sell it to customers already. So do you have customers lined up already? And given that this is hyperspectral imaging, and you have a lot of established players who already sell data, both optical, and you have existing satellite imagery like Landsat and everything. So A, how do you differentiate yourself from them? B, how do you convince them to buy your product, right? And obviously the question then comes of cost, because that is always there. So how do you deal with all of that?
Yeah, so I would say there are three types of customers that there are. One, customers that are working with existing data sets, but they all know that hyperspectral is the next frontier because they've already worked with it in limited context. So it's the easiest to sell to them because they've been waiting for this data set since quite some time to come in from space. So you go to them and say, hey, we're building hyperspectral, and they're like, yeah, we've been waiting for this data set. So they're the most willing to come on board and be early adopters. The second set is people who are working with existing data set, but then hyperspectral doesn't really add a whole lot of additional value, so they're happy to stick with what they are. Those are the ones that we typically tend to stay away from right now. And finally, there are use cases and companies where they don't even have an idea that hyperspectral is something that could help them. That's where a little bit of educational and knowledge transfer would be required. So if mainly focus on 1 and 3, knowledge building would be a significant component because a lot of people struggle to work with even multispectral data. When you bring hyperspectral data, complexity increases, and that's why our platform is trying to make that easier, but also it will require use cases we ourselves demonstrate to say, hey, look, this is what you have been doing till date, but this is what hyperspectral data can help you make more efficient or make better. We already have customers from the first bucket that I mentioned who have been waiting for this. They want to explore hyperspectral data. They already know what specific advantages it will bring with it, so they're happy to sign agreements that say, once our imagery comes down, they're happy to pay for it. So it's agreements for future sale. So we already those lined up in the agriculture domain, in the mining domain, in the oil and gas domain, I would say. And finally, we're already working with a couple of paying clients also. What we have is a smaller version of the camera, hyperspectral camera that we can put on a drone to showcase this use case. We show them that, hey, you wanted to identify between different crop species. Here is how we can do it in a small plot land. Once we show them to them firsthand, now they have more confidence that they can do it at a larger scale. So that's how we've been working with the clients predominantly.
So, speaking of money, so do you have a series of models for selling data and providing services, not just data, right, to your customers? So do you have tiered, and I mean, how do you plan to sell your data essentially?
It's fairly simple, I would say. So if they just want the imagery, they can go to our platform or they can connect it through an API into their workflow. I'll take some example numbers. If it's a 100 square kilometer area that they want imagery for and they want it on a daily basis, we, for example, say price it at $1 per square kilometer. So for a 100 square kilometer image, every time that they buy it, they're paying $100, 100 times 1. Now if they want it daily, so it becomes 365 times this much, 365, 36,500, right? So that's how essentially they pay. So these contracts are usually multi-year in nature, but they pay on a monthly basis, on a pay-as-you-use basis. So it's a subscription-based model where they go into the platform and essentially a SaaS model. If they want additional things on top of the imagery and they want it analyzed again, that $1 might become 1.5 or 2 depending on what additional things that they're taking. But at all points, they will have clarity on what they're going to be spending if they use these. and they only pay on a as you use basis on a monthly basis. Yeah.
When it comes to analyzing satellite data, um, a lot of times you need 3D stereo data, GIS included, and multi-sensor, um, say multi-platform imagery, so that you can put it all together and then analyze it together. So we've seen a lot of papers where people bemoan the fact that they can get imagery of a single place, but it's at different angles and at different times of the day, and it's just not conclusive, conducive for research. So, how do you manage something like that, especially for say crops and oil spills or something like that?
Yeah, we tend to stick to the use cases that only our data is able to do without a lot of additional data sets. For example, yield prediction would require weather data, it would require historical data, it would require census data. So we don't really get into that ourselves. If someone's already working on that problem themselves and hyperspectral data is one data set they need to ingest, we're happy to provide it to them, but we ourselves don't get into the hassle of putting it all together. The platform will also have the capability of a marketplace where you'll have additional data sets for people who want to choose to work with those along with our imagery. But we ourselves don't really bother with what other data sets people need. We just try to make sure that our data is uniform, and that's something that's really usable by our customers.
So, if say a big customer comes up and says, he wants an additional sensor with which provides parallel data, or maybe even somehow later you decide. So, do you plan on doing multi-sensor satellites in the future when you scale it up?
Yeah, we plan to add additional types of imagery into the constellation, but not into the same satellite. The satellites are fairly modular, so we can replace this payload with some other payload and then launch in the future. So the constellation is planned to be holistic. So we might look at getting into thermal infrared data, or might look at getting into some amount of multispectral data, right? As and when it makes sense, but only after our predominant hyperspectral constellation is already working. But yeah, there might be additional interspersed satellites which are not hyperspectral in the constellation.
Yeah, the reason for my question being, there are already SAR and RF constellation companies working around the globe. And speaking from a defense security perspective, you don't always get access to very high resolution either SAR or even RF data from these satellites because they're not, Indian companies. So even if you're willing to pay, you're not able to get that whatever data sets that they collect. So would you be willing to build an RF or a SAR constellation sometime in future, because your current constellation would be up by another couple of years?
That's correct. No, I think that's the plan. If and when it makes sense for us, if there's a willing customer that says that, hey, we need these satellites, we need this imagery, then it makes sense for us to go and do that. From a capability standpoint, the facility that we set up, the team that we're building, will be capable of doing it. As a company priority right now, it's hyperspectral data, but as and when new priorities and then interest comes in and demand comes in, that's definitely the plan, especially for Indian owned and operated satellites that Indian organizations would need data for, that you are not able to get from outside. So yeah, that's something that we do intend to do.
So your plan is to put in 36 satellites in another couple of years. Given that ISRO's launch rates have been rather slow, I mean, low in the past few years. So what launch vehicles do you have planned for your constellation to go up?
Yeah, so for the constellation itself, it's right now an open question. If an SSLV does come up, then we can plug in 10 to 15 of our satellites in one rocket and send it up there, which would mean that it would require 2 to 3 launches to put it up there. However, we are not wedded to one launch operator. It would make a lot of sense for us logistically and otherwise if we do launch it from India itself. But for example, our second satellite is booked on a SpaceX rocket. And that decision was fairly simple because there was no other ISRO option or launch at that time into the orbit we wanted. So we had to choose something that was going there. We have good relationships with Rocket Lab and with Astra and a whole bunch of these rocket companies. So as long as there's rockets going up, we are happy to send it from anywhere. But it would make a whole lot of sense if we can do that from here, of course.
Coming back to the previous question, so the defense ministry has an IDEX program which funds and helps out startups in the defense field. In terms of funding too, right? So funding is a big question, especially for companies in India. What has been your experience in terms of raising funds for your company right from scratch, right? So when it was an idea, And now when you want to scale up and you need a lot more money than initial seed funding that you might have needed right at the beginning. So how's your journey been, and how difficult has it been? Because I remember your heartfelt tweet thread sometime back about how difficult it was.
It has been. So I think every time that we have gone out to raise a particular round, that was the most difficult round to raise at that point in time. Like we raised a pre-seed round, and then a few months later, given the successes that people were able to see from other companies, pre-seed became relatively easier. We raised a seed round, and then 6 months, 8 months, 10 months down the line, raising a seed round became easier. So at every point in time, since we were one of the first companies out there going out and raising that round, no one had really seen that before. Especially in India, we have seen how the interest has gradually grown. When we started the pre-seed round, it predominantly came from angel investors, people who were willing to look at it as sort of philanthropy. If it worked, it worked. If it didn't work, it didn't work, sort of a thing. And then when we raised the seed round, there were still very few venture capital firms that were looking at it. We talked to a whole lot of them, and thankfully, finally, Lightspeed and Bloom and these folks came on board for us to be able to do that. And now it's a challenge for us to go on and raise a much larger round where people can come in from a Series A, Series B perspective. When you look at a deep tech or a space tech startup, Series A metrics that you need to look at for a SaaS startup versus a deep tech startup are quite different. So it's definitely difficult. You need to be able to prove that the market is big. You need to be able to prove that this is not a 0 or 1 game right now. It's not a win or lose situation. We are now at a point where we have enough cash to be able to at least have one working satellite, and after that, it should be an easy game. So when we first raised pre-seed round, it was very tough for VCs to come on board, and when we raised seed round, it was very difficult for even a VC to come on board. But now seed funding is sort of is a little relatively easier, but raising growth rounds is gonna start getting tougher. So yeah.
Speaking of money, it reminds me that you're a young college kid, and then you go to your parents and ask them for money, saying, "I'm going to build my own company." What was their reaction? How difficult was it to convince them?
It was actually fairly easy, thankfully. They're very supportive. When I got into college, my dad was like, "Get a job in a nice multinational company, so you don't have to worry about running a business or something of that sort." But then when I said that this is something that we want to do, we want to build our own satellite and launch it, had to borrow quite a bit. I had to break my own FD of the savings that I had, but then also had to borrow quite a lot of money to get it started. But there was never a no that came in from there, even though things were sort of tough, which is something I'm grateful for. So like the support was there. I wouldn't say I struggled to at least get the initial seed money to get it started.
Okay. So especially in terms of money and as well as facilities and using the testing facilities and anything as labs and even picking their brains for say design help and just building your own thing. How easy has it been? How cooperative has ISRO been? Department of Space has been? And in terms of money, right, which is a big question for say a predominantly middle class Indian or maybe even a poor student who has stars in his eyes. How would he go about putting together something like what you have done?
Yeah, so I think from the support perspective, we have also seen a change there. Initially, when we started, there was no mandate to help private companies, which meant that when we initially wanted to launch from ISRO, that didn't happen. When we initially wanted to use those testing facilities, that didn't happen. But in 2020, when there was an announcement that space was to be privatized, then things suddenly changed. We got a call from the Department of Space that they wanted us to launch from India, so we shifted our launch from Russia back to India. We said we want testing facilities to help accelerate this bit, so we got access to the URO Satellite Center here in Bangalore, where we tested our satellite. So that way, the support has been tremendous because now they want to see the private sector succeed. But I would say that wasn't the case in 2019. It was not that they didn't want to, it was not that there was no mandate there or no motivation from there and to be able to go out of their way to do that. So that has thankfully changed, and we hope that going ahead, it'll become easier and easier for us to be able to do it. As to anyone that's coming up today, how they go about doing it, there's a few of these grants that the Department of Science and Technology has, or the Niti Aayog Atal Innovation Mission comes up with. So keep an eye out for those, and if you have an idea, you look at what is the minimum viable product out of the large prototype you want to build and say apply for those grants. Those equity-free grants will enable you to get started on working on something. Once you have shown some demonstrable executional progress, then I would say there's enough pre-seed, early seed, and seed stage funds and angel investors that can come in and fund you to take it to the next level. So at each point in time, you have to execute only a little bit that gets you to that next milestone. But to start with, if someone has no resources, you have some amount of grants that you can get from DST or from Niti Aayog or from elsewhere.
So right now, do you think it's streamlined enough where it's easy to get information about where to go for funding?
It's not for sure. We are not even at a level where we are competing with, say, Europe or with US, right? The United States gives up to $2 million in equity free funding for people building prototypes through their SBIR programs. You have Europe, where you have these business incubation centers through which ESA gives some amount of money, hundreds of thousands of euros. We don't have anything of that sort. What we do have is a few tens of lakhs that sort of come in from some places, and even that is not streamlined. So it requires a little bit of a hard work to go and search from where can you do this, when can you do this, and it's not that it repeats every year and so forth. You have to keep an eye out for when it might come out, when an opportunity might arise or whatnot. But it's, as I said, it's moving in the optimistic direction from 2 years ago compared to now. There's a lot more of these opportunities. You can search these on Google. But in terms of having it completely streamlined, we're still some ways away from that. Hopefully, in about a year or two from now, since things are moving along, we'll be in a position to do that.
Is there anything specific that really that you think we must focus on to get things on track?
Policy, I think having liberal policy would be very critical. When you look at Luxembourg, they started very late, but then they built a liberal space policy, which means more companies flocked there. And they had investment that was sort of there from the government side of things, like a sovereign fund and venture capital. Even if the money part is not there, having a liberal policy means that people can innovate much freely, which means more companies will come up and something will happen. Secondly, when you look at the US, I think for all their faults, we have a system which works. If you apply for this license within this amount of time, you get a response, whether a yes or a no, and then you have steps that you can take to be able to turn that no into an yes. That's something that we don't have right now. We need a single window of application which is in space, but we need to say that, okay, if we submit this application, we're going to get a response for this in 2 weeks. We're going to complete the entire application process in 3 months, something that the US commits to. So I think having a liberal policy, but also having clarity on how to go about it and how long will it take for someone to plan their activities out will be very critical. That's something that's very specific, where we see a pain point today.
So one particular instance, I remember reading a paper saying hyperspectral imaging can be used for maritime surveillance and just generally keeping an eye on even ship detection. So your sensor that you're planning to send up, what resolution can it do? And have you looked at the maritime industry also for the shipping industry maybe, and even the Navy if they want to?
Yeah, so 5 meter is the resolution that our constellation is going to be, which is going to be the best commercial hyperspectral resolution never attempted. The closest right now is 30 meters, right? China has a 10-meter constellation, but that's close to that part of the world. For the rest of the world, it's been 30 meters. We're going to better that to 5 meters. With 5 meters, yes, you can identify whether there is ships there. You can't really get into the details of those. But what hyperspectral uniquely helps with is identifying the material of the ship. So you can tell whether this was this type of ship or that type of ship if you have a spectral signature to match it with. Apart from the maritime industry, I would say it's predominantly coastal monitoring to seeing how the health status of the cropland, the coastland is changing. But I would believe, yes, there will be some applications to maritime. I would still say that high resolution satellites should be better suited to maritime, but there's going to be some unique use cases like material identification where hyperspectral would help.
So as your constellation gets built up, are you looking at an upgraded set of sensors, say in a couple of years?
Not really. So I would say we will continuously iterate on the designs that we have to better this resolution. But the lifetime of these satellites is 5 years at least. So once we send these up there, they'll operate for 5 years. In the meanwhile, maybe 3 years down the line, yes, if there's a significant step function in terms of the resolution that we managed better, we do plan to send them up.
So if I'm not wrong, you said you have no plans on building 3D data sets, right?
We do not at this point, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
But are you looking at something like that?
We can. So 3D data set essentially is when you have the satellites looking from one slew angle and then other slew of angle. We do have that capability for us to be able to do that. 5 meters, I don't think would lead to a whole lot of map making related things. You need sub-meter for that. So we do have the capability, but I don't see whether that would make more commercial sense for us right now.
if you want to build a satellite, I mean, any company, any technology-based company for, say, somebody in the second or third year of engineering or any college for that matter. So, what advice would you give them today when they're starting out, or when it's still a dream in their heads and they've done nothing concrete yet? So, given you've come to this level, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, it would be that spend time exploring and finding what you love doing. For me, it was space technology, and that got crystallized, as I mentioned, while I was at the SpaceX factory. Right, everyone is going to have a different passion, different love for what they do. But once you have found that, you just have to begin. Like when we started on the Hyperloop project, we had no idea we would go to the point where we would actually build something. We started because we wanted to meet Elon Musk, and this might be a possibility. So we submitted a design. The design got selected surprisingly, so we had to build a much more robust design and then go to the PDR stage and then do the CDR stage. And at each point we kept getting through, and then we just upped the game. But all that started because we just had the initial initiative to go ahead and start it. Even with Pixel, we could have waited for a whole lot of things, but we just said, okay, let's start raising sponsorship to send a satellite. We went to OnePlus, we went to Samsung, and we said, hey, can you sponsor us? We will put your phone camera there, so if you get a money shot, you can advertise that. Didn't work out. And then we pivoted to saying we might have to raise investment now, but we wouldn't have known how to do that if we hadn't started on it. So it's never going to be the right time for you to do that. At that point in time, there was no space policy in India. There was no intent of privatizing space. We didn't know whether it was going to happen or not, but we said we'll figure it out anyway. So we started on it. So I would say, if I were to look back and give advice to myself or to anyone else, it would be figure out what you love. And once you know that, just get started on that journey once you have that vision in place.
Okay. And then how do you get other people to believe in you and then come and join you, right? Because you started off with a couple of people and then became 36.
In the end, it's about if it's a worthwhile goal and people know that the work that you're doing is actually going to be impactful, that makes a difference. It's easier because it's a space tech company which is sort of considered cool and people would want to come and work for it. But otherwise, when you want to have people that are in it for the long run, it's about how you make an impact. For us, it's building a health monitor for the planet. The satellites we build, we have fun doing it, but once we do up there and the data that comes down is actually going to help make the world a better place, and then we need to build the software tools to make that happen. So as long as we keep that in mind and know that, the work that we're doing is fun, but the work that we're doing is also going to be impactful, that provides some amount of meaning to people who, tend to leave ISRO and then come over or then, do something else. So I think that's, it just becomes a function of, what your end goal or vision is.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We hope your first launch goes well and then the rest of the constellation goes up just as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a pleasure.